brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. In this series, I dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join me in real time by sending me your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN application, email me at thepointwithlx@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. We air Headline Buster on Fridays at 11 a.m. Beijing time, so get in touch and we might read out your comments. Speaking of which, let's take a look at some comments from social media on today's topic, China's space program. From Chris Paul, having numerous spacefaring nations is not a bad thing. It is a sad distortion of nationalism that makes this positive momentum toward a second space station feel like a loss. From Ben, the International Space Station is the finest example of international collaboration, but China has never been allowed to join. China launched its own space station today. This is the definition of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Wade Wang says space exploration is a matter for all mankind. Outside the Earth, all countries have a common name, that is the Earth. All countries deserve to be congratulated for their success in every small step in space exploration. Well, thank you for all your comments. Please keep them coming through the show, and we'll try to bring them up in the discussion part. Today, as the comments suggest, we are bringing you to outer space and talking about China's plans to build a space station. How are those plans depicted in the media? As one more exciting leap for mankind, or as another cause for concern or threat from China? Before we look at our examples, a bit of background. China successfully launched the core module of a new space station on April the 29th. It was the first of 11 planned missions to deliver astronauts, supplies, and laboratory modules to build what will become China's first low Earth orbital space station called Tiangong, or Heavenly Palace, before the end of 2022. Now, the core module, called Tianhe, meaning heavenly harmony, was blasted into space by a Long March carrier rocket launched from South China's Hainan province. Tianhe will be at the center of the T-shaped space station, acting as the command center and living space for astronauts. On either side of Tianhe, there will be two lab capsules, namely Wentian and Mengtian. The space station will be able to support up to 6 astronauts at once. Now, the European Space Agency sent a message on its Twitter account to congratulate China. Building the space station is one of China's most complicated space missions so far. Last month's launch also marks the beginning of the third phase of China's manned space program, which was approved by the government in 1992. The first phase was to send astronauts into space and return them safely. The second phase was to test key technologies such as space rendezvous and docking through the launch of a space lab. And the third phase, to assemble and operate a permanently crewed space station. And those are just a few of China's recent space endeavors. Last December, China's Chang'e 5 mission returned samples from the moon's surface, making China the third country after the US and the former Soviet Union to do so. So what will China's new space station be used for? Hao Chun, director of the China Manned Space Agency, said in a recent interview, "We are willing to work with any space institutes that are peace-loving and devoted to the peaceful use of space." Mind the word any. He also added that there will be foreign astronauts participating in China's manned space flight and working and staying in China's space station. Many of them have been learning Chinese for this purpose. Cooperation in regard to Tianhe has already been well underway. China has cooperated with the United Nations, among others, for instance, to select science experiments from around the world to be carried out on board its new space station. By the end of 2020, a total of 9 projects had been selected for the first cycle of cooperation. They involved 23 institutions from 17 countries, including both developing and developed ones such as Germany, Switzerland, Poland, India, Japan, and Peru. It's worth noting that China does not exclude any country from cooperation in space exploration. When China's first Mars mission Tiangong-1 was launched last July, a foreign ministry spokesperson made it clear that China stands ready to work with other countries on the basis of mutual respect, openness and inclusiveness, equality and mutual benefit. And now China is determined to build a space station that's open to all. It's a story about innovation, cooperation, and what humans are capable of achieving in outer space. And now, what's the impression you get when you read about the story in the international media? Let's take a look at a few examples. My first example comes from CNN, which published an article called "China Successfully Launches First Module of Planned Space Station." The headline is neutral, but the opening and the overall structure indicate that when it comes to space, it seems to be China versus international cooperation. The article opens with concerns over the future of international cooperation by saying, for more than 2 decades, the International Space Station has orbited 227 nautical miles above Earth, with more than 200 astronauts from 19 different countries enjoying stints aboard. The article adds, but its role as the sole venue for a continuous human presence in space, scientific research, and a testing ground for future space exploration is coming to a close, potentially signaling an end to an unparalleled era of international cooperation in space. Now, the International Space Station, of course, or ISS, is the only space station currently in orbit and consists of cooperation between the US, Russia, Canada, Japan, and the member states of the European Space Agency. China is de facto excluded from the ISS by a US law enacted in 2011 forbidding the NASA to cooperate with Chinese scientists working for government-funded entities. The unparalleled era of international cooperation on board the ISS has not been so great for China. Regardless, why would international cooperation have to end for anyone? Why couldn't it continue with China's space station? China has been cooperating with international counterparts all along in its space programs. So don't worry, international cooperation in space won't be ending. Now, if you take a step back and scan other recent coverage on China's space program, it often seems to pose a threat akin to the space race, or worse. Here's one typical example about China and Russia planning to jointly build an international scientific research station on or around the moon. The New York Times in March published an article about the memo the two sides signed about the plan, titled "China and Russia Agree to Explore the Moon Together." Sounds straightforward enough, but then in the very first paragraph, the article says the plan sets the stage for a new space race. But is space race an accurate comparison in this situation? What has been called the space race was part of the Cold War rivalry between the US and former Soviet Union starting in the 1950s, and the race refers to the competition to achieve superior space flight capability. So this term has a negative connotation. In China's case, as I said before, it doesn't really have a choice but to build one. But China doesn't see it as a Cold War-style rivalry. China basically has all along rejected the idea of Cold War mentality and Cold War-style policies. In terms of size, China's space station will be a quarter of that of the International Space Station. How can you call it a race when there's such a difference in size and capacity? On top of that, China has been cooperating and pledged to continue to do so in the areas of space, life science, biotechnology, and astronomy, and so on. Basically, China's international cooperation in space is going well, except with the United States. Regardless, the New York Times article clings to this Cold War mindset, asserting that although China pledged to keep the joint project with Russia open to all interested countries and international partners, it seemed all but certain to exclude the United States and its allies in space exploration. What makes the journalists so sure that the US and its allies would be shut out? They seem to project their own thinking onto China and others. And the New York Times is not alone. Many media published opinion pieces using the same space race analogy. Newsweek had a piece titled "China, Russia and America, a Cold War in Cold Space." A piece from The Hill asks, will Biden's NASA win the space race with China? Bloomberg also published 3 opinion pieces sounding an alarm about China-Russia cooperation in space. But that's not the whole story. Time, on April the 15th, published an article titled, "Why the US and China Should Collaborate in Space." I think that's an interesting one to recommend. It says Sino-American Space Cooperation could improve ties as it did for the US and Russia, although the article compares China-Russia cooperation as an emerging Sino-Russian axis in space and sees US collaboration with China as a potential bargaining chip to help sustain other areas of cooperation. The author does advocate cooperation, which is always a good thing. The article even gave specific proposals, such as China creating a data share program for their Earth imaging systems. To put it all in perspective, the article says, for decades, space travel has provided an opportunity for humans to see our world differently. Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins said, "The thing that really surprised me was that the Earth projected an air of fragility." Chinese astronauts, since Yang Liwei's first flight 18 years ago, have surely had a similar experience gazing down at our planet. I tend to agree. We share this fragile planet. The US and China should collaborate in space and whichever other areas where it's beneficial and necessary, despite legal or political obstacles, because everybody will stand to benefit. What do you think? Send us your comments, and when we come back, I'll talk to my guests about China's ambitions, if we're really in a new space race, and how to promote international cooperation in space, and maybe read out your comments too. Making sense of the overwhelming wave of information means cutting through the noise to shine a light on the heart of the story and making room for new perspectives. True understanding means the ability to see events from more than one side. I'm Liu Xin, and this is The Point. Welcome back to Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Liu Xin. Let's get into our panel discussion, and I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Mr. Yang Yuguang. He's professor with China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. From Washington, D.C. by Amitabh Ghosh, chair of Science Operations Group of NASA Mars Exploration Rover Mission, and Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, president of Grasshopper Strategies, joining us from Philadelphia. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Brandon, now you coming from a political analysis point of view and coming from maybe more a geopolitical analysis point of view, do you think it has been hyped, this idea of a space race? Are we really talking about something like a race, a rivalry, that is qualified?
I think we need to understand that the term space race, and when it's being used by media, means a wide range of things. There are some media that are going for the negative connotations of it and things like that, and inviting the Cold War very heavily in the comparison. But I actually think that the space race phrase is actually a positive one. Even in historical context, the space race is one of the few even remotely positive things that came out of the Cold War. The 1975 handshake by a cosmonaut and an American astronaut in space was watched by the world. It was celebrated by the world. It laid the foundation in the 80s, at really the height of the Cold War, for NASA and the Soviet Union to cooperate in the early stages of what led to the International Space Station. I mean, these are massive technological advances that were built through competition that was eventually found ways to collaborate during. Where I think there's been a mistake is that the United States in 2011 decided that the road to collaboration just wasn't the future of space exploration. Many of its partners, from Russia to European partners, have complained about the US pulling back from collaboration rather than finding ways to enjoy competition and engaging with each other, to realize that this is a race we are all running into a much more exciting future. And sometimes it's going to be competitive, but if we can keep it positively competitive, then we're going to end up getting there faster with better technology, with better options.
Well, yeah, from China's perspective, Mr. Yang, does China see it from a positively constructive perspective, or does China feel that, the threat, the potential threat, or China's ambition has been overly exaggerated and often looked through a political prism.
Well, you see, Brandon and I have different definition of view of the competition or a race. You see that a race or competition is not only concerned with what you should do, but also concerned with when you should do it. You see that during the space race between US and the former Union, they almost launch spacecraft or spaceship every month or even or every 2 months, so very frequently. So that is a risk because they want to be the first. But now you see that China, although we have a very ambitious space program, but we do it very, very slowly. So we only launch a spacecraft or 2 every year or even every 2 years. So you see that this shows that this is a very strong evidence that we only developed these kind of space program or space schemes according to our own. You see that China is a developing country, but also a very big country, especially a big country in space field. So you see that the decision makers think that it is right for China to develop this kind of space program, but not to compete or have a race with other countries.
Yeah, Mr. Yang, I get your point. I think our guests get your point. Mr. Ghosh, what is your definition or perception of the term space race? Do you think it is proper to be used here?
I don't think it is proper. I do agree with Dr. Yang's perspective here. From my perch, I see more cooperation. But if I go to the media, suddenly there is a space race. So as I think Dr. Yang pointed out, so imagine today a person who is making plans. So all these things take tens of years to plan, 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
So somebody who's planning what NASA is going to do in 2031 is not looking at newspaper reports to determine what China should be doing. And same with NASA. So they are going their own way. And it's not like they're trying to compete for similar goalposts. They're not trying to do that same exact thing. And even if they're going to Mars, Mars is a big planet. The surface area of Mars is equal to the surface area of Earth. So I think the term space race here is not quite appropriate.
I see. Well, I hope and I believe that most policymakers don't base their policies on everyday news reports. Unfortunately, public opinion can be swayed, right? Public sentiments can be guided by these reports. We have a comment coming in, and let's take a look at that comment to see what it says. And here we have it. It's from Rajat Rasul. The station will open ways for those whom are considered as hostile or abandoned by the US and its allies. It is going to decrease states' dependency on US for space exploration. So 2 points here. First of all, whether there is a kind of dependency that is being exploited by the United States and its allies in the current ISS or International Space Station endeavor. And secondly, whether China has this idea in mind, when it develops its own space station. I want to go to Mr. Ghosh first and then to Mr. Yang.
Right. So I think this is absolutely a misperception. If you look at the US, what is it doing? It is outsourcing a lot of the space stuff to SpaceX and Blue Origin. So it does not have its own capability. So the thing that somehow the US is kind of holding back capability and controlling capability, so they are actually letting go. They're telling the private sector here that, well, so the next step you saw SpaceX launching to the space station. The next step is they're going to just pay some private companies to buy some data from the moon. So that private company will go launch a rocket, land on the moon, collect the experiments. What the US government wants is just data. So somehow this perception that the US is trying to control access to space or technology is, I don't know, is far from the truth. And quick point about this perception of, I think, Mr. Brandon mentioned that a section of the people in the US are disgruntled that China is doing this, that, and the other. I think there are many landings which happened, and I think there's an overwhelming positive feeling, certainly among scientists who will get more data. And I think the general public, I think the cause of science is being furthered. If China's or India's rover were to discover life on Mars, do you think everybody in the world is going to get angry and say, well, we are not going to accept the result? Of course not.
Mr. Yang, your answers to this question, please.
Well, I would rather call it multiple choices. You know that several years before, professor from Beijing Institute of Technology, Professor Deng Yulin, has brought his scientific instruments to the international spaces with the help of NanoRacks, an American company. So you see that now, not only Beijing Institute of Technology, but other universities in other countries has a choice to utilize China's space station. So I think it is a responsibility of a space capable nation to bring chance for other countries to have experiment in space.
Will there be a fault line along geopolitical sense in the space station? I mean, U.S. and its allies primarily choosing the U.S. Platforms, and China and the other countries, possibly its closer friends, choosing the Chinese platform. Mr. Yang.
Well, I think that I think there is no differences. You see that. As I mentioned, the scientists from China has already also delivered applications to with the help of an American company. But also you see that with the help of UN, there is no difference for which country can raise this kind of proposal to have this kind of scientific research work on China's space station.
Okay, Brandon, you're quick-minded and you are very creative. If you are going to be coming up with a term, what alternative would you use instead of space race? Because space race does have a Cold War connotation to it, although you might like it. It does conjure some kind of negative sentiment in people's mind. Is there any other choice you can come up with for the moment?
For the moment, the best one I've read, which I don't think is great, is constructive competition. I think it has a nice alliteration, but it still has the word competition in it. I think that there's got to be a better phrase for it.
Okay.
But the reality is that people can find a cause by joining into the idea that we are improving each other. Now, what I do think is important though is, as we look at China's role in all of this, we're seeing fault lines form, I think in part, and I'm speaking from a political perspective, that the United States has made this problem itself. We haven't really spent much time talking about the Wolf Amendment that effectively means that the United States really cannot directly cooperate with China on space exploration. This amendment has led to a situation where Russia is basically saying, like, look, we want to cooperate with the United States and we want to cooperate with China. So we're going to sign separate agreements and never the twain shall meet, because our U.S. partners can't work with China because they just can't do it. And I think we're going to see, hopefully not political fault lines form around that, but we're going to see some bifurcation in exploration a little bit around that, rather than be hand in hand.
Okay, Mr. Ghosh.
So I have a quick question to make. I think the term space race is completely irrelevant now. Right now the race is with the private sector. If SpaceX can deliver a flight to Mars at 1,000th of the cost, I think all nations will go to that. Any nation will go to that. So the Wolf Amendment is, it monitors collaboration between NASA and China. So the star of the show here is SpaceX. SpaceX and the private sector is going to completely redefine. If you were watching the news, the SpaceX Starship, it landed safely yesterday. This is what's going to carry human astronauts to the moon. It's going to completely change the cost structure. So the race would be between the private sector and the government sector. So I think we are looking at a very different era going forward. I mean, all this we're thinking about is going to be not relevant.
But you see, you don't see many of those stories. At least our researchers haven't seen many of those stories talking about the race between the public sector and the private sector in the space arena. It's not a sexy story for the politically minded media sector. Probably, I don't know. They're all talking about the space race, especially when China and Russia teamed up. Finally, one question from Ghosh, as you really are working on this Mars mission. You said, of course, China and the United States are in different phase of their space program. But is there any potential area where the United States could also use some data that, or some facilities that China may have put in place already?
Absolutely, and that depends on the individual researcher level. So what we don't know is a lot of the data from NASA missions, and I don't know about Chinese missions, are freely available to the internet to anybody in the world. And so you can go to the website and just download the data and look at what experiments yielded whatever data. So yes, but there can be collaboration, but as Brandon mentioned, there is the wolf act. So you have to make sure that you are in compliance. You're not doing anything against the wolf act, which is understandable. So the answer is, it's very, very tough to say.
Okay. Well, we are going to keep it there. Fascinating discussion. I thank you to my guests for your wonderful insights and your time set aside for the discussion. I have been talking to Mr. Yang Yuguang from China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation, Mr. Amitabh Ghosh, Chair of Science Operations Group of NASA Mars Exploration Rover Mission, and Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, President of Grasshopper Strategies. And many thanks to our viewers for having followed us on this edition of Headline Buster, brought to you by The Point with me, Lu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Lu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Keep the comments coming. I'll see you on the next edition of HMB.